From the very first day I moved into Willow Creek Shores, I knew the neighborhood had its quirks. But nothing prepared me for the extreme level of obsession that one woman, Karen, would develop over something as simple as my boat. I had bought the lakefront house partly because of the community, partly because of the peaceful environment, but mostly because of the private dock that came with the property. My boat, a vintage 1988 Monterey I'd restored myself over the years, was more than a vehicle. It was a piece of my history, a link to memories with my dad, and honestly the one thing I was proudest of owning. But apparently, to Karen, it was an eyesore, a violation, and later, community property. I thought she was just another nosy HOA leader with too much free time and too little personality. I didn't know then that my boat would become her obsession, or that her obsession would lead to the trap she'd walk right into. The very first complaint arrived before I'd even unpacked my boxers. It was a thin yellow paper slid under my door, with a neatly printed note about HOA guidelines regarding watercraft positioning, maintenance schedule expectations, and aesthetic compliance. I actually laughed when I read it. My boat was polished enough to blind someone at noon. I figured it was some generic rule they sent to all homeowners until the signature at the bottom caught my eye. Karen W., HOA President. Her handwriting looked sharp enough to cut through wood. 2 days later, I met her. She came marching down the hill toward my dock like a general approaching enemy territory. Her chin lifted so high, I thought she'd swallow the sky. She didn't bother to greet me, pointed at my boat like it had personally offended her. "That is not regulation length," she said, arms crossed like a shield. "It's grandfathered in," I replied calmly. The previous owner gave me the full history of every HOA debate involving the dock and boat size, and it turned out my property had certain rights established before the HOA even existed, something Karen seemed to ignore on purpose. The HOA can't enforce new rules on an old property. Her nostrils flared. "I'll check that myself," and she did. She checked everything. The angle of the rope knots, the distance between the hull and the dock, the reflection of the boat in the water like she was judging a beauty pageant she didn't want the contestant to win. She took pictures from every angle, then marched back up to her house like she'd discovered a crime scene. Every day, she'd show up with a new concern. One day it was the color of the cover. Another day it was the noise pollution of an engine that hadn't even been turned on that week. Once, she tried to claim the boat was attracting wildlife. I almost asked if she meant fish, but her expression wasn't built for humor. The harassment went on for weeks. I pretended to ignore her, partly because I didn't want to escalate things, and partly because I wanted to see how far she was willing to go. She'd walk around my dock like she owned it, snapping pictures with her phone, lecturing me in her shrill voice, and filing reports to the HOA board, none of whom took her seriously. But she kept pushing. I learned quickly that Karen hated when people didn't react to her. She thrived on confrontation, on someone flinching or getting flustered, but I gave her nothing. I was polite, calm, and completely unaffected, and that only made her more determined. One afternoon she cornered me near my own garage. Holding a binder that looked thicker than a college textbook, "I've documented 52 violations," she said triumphantly. "Against what?" I asked. She flipped the binder open. The pages were filled with printed photos of my boat, each marked with red circles, arrows, and handwritten notes, so aggressive they looked like scars on paper. "Against the community standards? We don't have 52 boat standards," I replied. She froze. Her lips tightened. She hated that I didn't argue back the way she expected. That binder alone told me one thing clearly. Karen wasn't annoyed by my boat, she was obsessed. And an obsessed person eventually crosses a line. I wasn't wrong. One morning, after a thunderstorm, I walked down to check the dock and found Karen standing on it like she was performing an inspection on the Queen's Navy. She didn't even look guilty. She looked proud. "I'm issuing a final warning," she announced. "For what?" I asked, tightening the rope on the boat. "For ignoring the HOA's authority." "I haven't ignored anything," I said. "I've complied with every legal requirement." "That's not enough," she said, and the way she said it made something click in my mind. This wasn't about the boat. This was about control. My boat was just a symbol, something I owned, that she couldn't dictate. And that drove her insane. When she walked away, my neighbor, Mr. Lowe, approached me. He was an older man with a gentle smile and a deep dislike for HOA drama, especially Karen. "She's been talking," he said quietly. "Says the board is planning to seize your boat." I raised an eyebrow. "Seize it? On what grounds?" He shrugged. "Karen grounds." That's when I started paying attention. Karen had been pushing the HOA to classify certain objects as community nuisances and recoverable assets. She was trying to create loopholes if something violated enough rules. The HOA could temporarily confiscate it for assessment. Temporary, of course, in Karen's world, meant until she decided otherwise. I didn't know the full plan yet, but I knew one thing for sure. She wanted my boat, and not for the community. I'd caught her more than once, running her fingers along the polished wood like she was admiring a luxury item she felt entitled to. She'd always pull her hand away when she saw me watching, but it was too late. The interest was clear, so I waited. I let her think her plan was working. I let her think I was intimidated. I let her think I was careless enough not to notice. The way she lingered near the dock at night, or how she talked to certain HOA members in private. That's the thing about a trap who can't set one unless the other person believes they re the one in control. The tension grew after that. Karen became bolder, more invasive. She started showing up at odd hours, taking notes like some detective in a bad TV show. She'd complain louder, glare longer, and spread lies about how I was endangering the neighborhood. The more I ignored her, the more she spiraled. Because to someone like Karen, silence is gasoline poured on a fire. Then one afternoon, as I was washing the deck near the dock, she appeared again. But this time, she didn't bother pretending to be polite or professional. She stood there, hands on her hips, practically vibrating with determination. "Enjoy it while you can," she said, nodding toward the boat. "It won't be yours for long." I didn't respond. I didn't have to. She wanted a reaction, and I'd learned the fastest way to push her off balance was to give her nothing. She stormed off. But that was the moment I knew she had made her decision. She wasn't going to file another complaint. She wasn't going to argue. She was going to take it. She was going to steal my boat, and that's exactly what I wanted her to do. Because by then, I'd already started planning. My security cameras were upgraded. My dock sensors were calibrated. My legal paperwork was organized. My audio recordings of her threats were stored. Everything she didn't know was already in motion. I didn't need to stop her from stealing the boat. I needed her to steal it, so I waited for the night. She'd finally crossed the line. The night her obsession would drown her. The night I'd let her steal what she thought she was winning, only to learn it was something she never should have touched. Because it wasn't just a boat, it was a trap. The shift from petty harassment to an actual coordinated plan happened so smoothly that if I hadn't been paying attention, I might have missed it entirely. Karen was persistent, but she was also predictable. Her obsession with my boat was personal, emotional, irrational, everything I could anticipate. But what I didn't expect was how quietly she'd begin pulling the HOA board into her vendetta, twisting rules and manipulating procedures, trying to turn her personal fixation into an official community action. That was when I realized I wasn't just dealing with a nosy neighbor. I was dealing with someone who was willing to rewrite the system to get what she wanted. It started with rumors, strange comments from neighbors, a few whispered concerns, a couple of offhand remarks that didn't make sense at first. Mrs. Green from across the street mentioned how the board is tightening rules for dock usage, and Mr. Patterson casually asked if I'd received the revised watercraft compliance letter. Of course, I hadn't because Karen hadn't sent it yet, but she was preparing the ground. I noticed the pattern immediately: small changes in HOA meeting notes, subtle edits in the community bulletins, phrases like maintenance limits, temporary removal authority, and non-compliant asset review creeping in, all vague enough to slip past anyone who wasn't paying attention, but clear enough for me to understand what she was building. The real confirmation came on a rainy Friday morning when I saw two HOA board members standing with Karen near my dock, their umbrellas tilted toward the boat as if discussing evidence at a crime scene. I didn't interrupt them. I watched from my living room window. They pointed, nodded, scribbled things down. Karen was talking in fast animated motions like someone pushing a sales pitch, or more accurately, a hostile takeover. I went outside only after they'd left. On the corner of my dock, taped to the railing to avoid getting wet, was a thin white envelope with the HOAS emblem. I didn't open it right away. I already had a good idea of what it contained. Instead, I took it inside, put it on my coffee table, and sat down as if preparing to read a verdict. And in a way, I was. The letter inside was written in Karen's tone, even if her name wasn't on it. It claimed my boat was out of compliance with updated community standards, and required temporary repositioning and voluntary relinquishment for assessment. Voluntary relinquishment. It was almost impressive how she managed to phrase theft in bureaucratic language. There was no signature from the board, only the vague HOA compliance department. There was no date of approval, number meeting notes, no vote result. The entire thing was an unofficial letter wrapped in official formatting, a forgery hiding in plain sight. I almost smiled, because this confirmed something important. Karen wasn't just trying to take my boat, she was doing it secretly, manipulatively, and most importantly, illegally. And I needed her to keep going. The deeper she dug her own hole, the better my outcome would be. The next move in her plan was more aggressive. Over the next week, I noticed small changes around my dock: chalk measurements marked on the concrete, new flags placed near the waterline, and even a laminated sign posted one evening declaring the dock under compliance review. I removed the sign, of course. The next day, she put up another one. When I removed it again, she switched to zip ties. When I cut those off, she filed another violation notice under my door. She was desperate now. The line between HOA procedure and Karen's personal mission had blurred to the point where even she didn't seem to know the difference anymore. One evening, I decided to attend an HOA meeting, silently, not participating, just listening, watching. I sat in the back corner, unnoticed at first. Karen stood at the front of the room with a stack of folders, smiling like she was delivering a keynote speech. "We have a rising issue of non-compliant watercraft in the community," she announced dramatically, as if she were reporting a natural disaster. A few board members exchanged puzzled looks. Only one watercraft existed in the community, mine. We need to address this for the safety, aesthetics, and property value of Willow Creek shores, she continued. One board member raised his hand. Are you referring to the boat on the private dock? Yes, Karen said, a little too quickly, but that dock is technically outside newer HOA restrictions, he said. It's been established for decades before the rules were created. Karen's eyes narrowed. She clearly wasn't expecting resistance, but that doesn't exempt it from safety standards, or from visual regulations, or from Karen, another board member interrupted gently. We've reviewed this before. The boat is compliant. Her smile froze, then cracked. It's not, she said, trying to regain control. There are several issues I've documented. I have photographic evidence. We've all seen the photos, the board member replied, and none of them show anything that violates a rule. Karen took a slow breath, gripping the edge of the podium. She wasn't just frustrated, she was cornered. She realized that she couldn't get the board to seize my boat legitimately, so she said something I didn't expect. Then we need new rules. The room went quiet. I leaned forward, interested. What kind of new rules? A board member asked cautiously. Rules that allow us to temporarily confiscate or remove objects that threaten community harmony, Karen said without shame. Whether old rules apply or not, confiscate, remove. She wasn't hiding her intention anymore. Someone laughed softly. Karen, we can't just take someone's property. It wouldn't be taking, she said. It would be reassigning for safety testing. I actually had to bite back a laugh. She was unbelievable. But the best part, the board rejected her completely. They reminded her that property rights are not something the HOA can override. They voted to table her proposal. They shut down every vague complaint she raised. But rejection didn't stop her, not someone like Karen. Once the official route failed, she turned to the unofficial one. The next week, she created a fake emergency HOA resolution. Not approved, not voted on, not recognized. She placed copies of it in neighbors' mailboxes, trying to create the illusion of authority. She whispered to people about safety risks. She claimed she had legal grounds to remove my boat. None of it was true, but she wasn't trying to convince the board anymore. She was preparing her justification for when she finally stole it. Her plan was simple. Make the neighbors believe the HOA had authorized the removal. Make the board believe the neighbors had supported it. Make me believe I had no choice. But she underestimated one thing: my patience. While she ran around planting lies like seeds, I focused on gathering proof. Audio recordings of her verbal threats, photos of her trespassing, copies of every fake letter she produced, screenshots of neighbors forwarding the false documents she circulated, even videos of her measuring my dock without permission. Every step she took, I documented. Every lie she told, I archived. Every rule she broke, I filed. Because I knew how this story would end, not with her winning, but with her caught still. The final confirmation came unexpectedly. From one of the board members themselves. Mr. Patterson stopped by my house one evening, nervous but concerned. Look, he said quietly, you didn't hear this from me, but Karen is planning something. She keeps talking about a scheduled removal of your boat. I'm aware, I said, but there's no scheduled removal, he whispered. The board didn't approve anything. She's forging documents. I nodded. I know. He blinked in surprise. You're not worried? I'm prepared, I said simply. He didn't ask more. Maybe he sensed I was right. Or maybe he realized that Karen's plan had already crossed the line. The following morning, I watched Karen from my window as she stood near my dock again, her arms folded, smiling faintly like someone admiring a prize she believed she'd already won. She looked confident, too confident. She had no idea that every step she took was exactly where I needed her to be. She didn't know I'd already installed motion-triggered cameras, pressure sensors, and tamper alarms around the dock. She didn't know I had already informed authorities about possible property theft. She didn't know the legal trap was already set waiting for the moment she crossed the line. She didn't know that stealing my boat was exactly what I wanted her to try, because once she acted, everything she had plotted, forged, manipulated, and fabricated would collapse on top of her. The plan she thought she was in control of was actually never hers at all. People always assume that when someone is planning to steal from you, especially something valuable, you should confront them, stop them, or at the very least warn them. But the thing about traps is simple. If you warn the target, the trap fails. And from the moment I realized Karen wasn't just obsessed with my boat but truly planning to take it, I understood that the quickest way to end her reign of harassment was not by stopping her, but by letting her make the biggest mistake of her life. Karen believed she was subtle. She believed her late-night visits to the dock went unnoticed. She believed the whispers she spread, the forged documents she printed, and the fake emergency resolutions she handed to neighbors were convincing. She believed she was the mastermind, but she didn't understand me at all. She didn't know that before moving to Willow Creek shores, I had spent years dealing with people who thought they were smarter than everyone else, people who believed rules were optional for them, people who felt entitled to what they hadn't earned. Karen wasn't new. Karen was familiar, and familiar meant predictable. So the moment I saw her eyes linger too long on my boat, The moment her complaints shifted from annoyance to fixation. The moment her voice cracked with desperation whenever the HOA refused her demands. I knew exactly where this was headed, and that was when I made my choice. I would pretend not to notice. It wasn't easy at first. Watching someone circle your property like a vulture takes patience. Ignoring the constant messages slipped under my door took discipline. Even pretending to smile casually at her as she delivered yet another baseless warning took effort. But I had a goal, and goals require strategy. Every time she came near my dock, I acted like I didn't care. I pretended to be busy with something else, cleaning tools, reading a book, talking on the phone. I wanted her to feel invisible. People like Karen need attention the way plants need water. Deprive them, and they grow desperate. Desperate people make reckless choices. Reckless choices create evidence, and I was collecting plenty. What Karen didn't know was that my dock wasn't just wood and bolts anymore. I had installed more protection on that thing than most people put on their homes. High-resolution cameras hidden inside solar lights. Microphones tucked beneath railings. Motion sensors disguised as decorative markers. Even my boat had a GPS tracker embedded deep inside the hull, something she could never find, even if she took the whole thing apart. I had prepared everything meticulously, but the most important part was psychological. I had to make Karen believe she was invisible, though. So, whenever I saw her creeping around at dusk, pretending she was checking safety conditions, I acted like I was too busy inside to care. When she peered through binoculars from her she really did that. I simply closed my blinds a little slower, as if unaware. The more I ignored her, the braver she became. One evening around 11 p.m., I watched her from my upstairs window as she tiptoed down the hill toward my dock. She wore a black hoodie, dark pants, and a baseball cap pulled so low it barely covered her face. For a moment, I thought she looked almost comical, like a cartoon burglar. But then I saw her pull out a flashlight and begin photographing the underside of my boat, checking knots, examining the ropes, and measuring distances with the focus of a scientist studying an artifact. That was the moment I knew the theft was no longer an idea. In her mind, it was a plan. Still, I didn't interrupt her. I just watched, documenting her every move. And later, when she finally scurried back up the hill and disappeared into her house, I whispered to myself, not yet. Let her go further, because if I stopped her early, she would claim she was only inspecting. She would twist the narrative again. But if she stole the boat, there was no interpretation, no loophole, no story she could craft that would protect her. She would be caught. Over the next 2 weeks, Karen became painfully predictable. Her nightly visits grew longer. Her daytime arguments became more dramatic. She even started telling neighbors that the boat removal had already been approved, a bold lie that amused everyone who actually attended HOA meetings. But what she didn't know was that those same neighbors were quietly sharing screenshots with me, texts in which she bragged about the operation, messages where she pretended to be in charge of things she had no authority over. Each message became another piece of the trap tightening around her. Then came the night I knew. She had chosen her moment. It was humid, silent, and dark, one of those still nights where the lake looks like a sheet of black glass. Around 2 in the morning, while the neighborhood slept, Karen slipped out of her house with a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. She moved with purpose this time, not stealth, not hesitation, but purpose. I watched from behind a slightly cracked window, hidden enough to remain unseen, but close enough to observe everything. She jogged down to the dock, her flashlight flickering weakly across the planks. She knelt beside the ropes, pulled out a large cutting tool from her bag, and began slicing through the ties holding the boat in place. She wasn't nervous. She wasn't looking around. She truly believed she had outplayed everyone. That made her next actions even more satisfying. She pulled out a pair of gloves, slipped them on, and carefully pushed the boat away from the dock until it drifted, slow and steady, into deeper water. Then she climbed into a small inflatable raft she had dragged behind her earlier that evening. She rowed toward the boat, tied her raft to it, and began pulling it toward the far end of the lake where the HOA storage shed was located. She genuinely believed she was relocating the boat for assessment, just as she claimed in her fake letters. She truly thought she was winning. I let her go. That was the hardest part. Watching something you love drift away into the darkness isn't easy, even when you know it's part of the plan. But I stayed still. I didn't rush outside. I didn't yell. I didn't take action, because she wasn't just stealing a boat. She was sealing her fate. The moment she touched the boat without permission, cameras activated. The moment she cut the ropes, alarms silently logged the time and motion. The moment she moved it across the property boundary, the GPS tracker registered unauthorized relocation. And the moment she crossed into the HOA storage area, the authorities were alert. Without any effort from me, but I still didn't move. Because psychologically, letting her believe she had succeeded was the final stroke of the trap. So I waited until dawn. Until the sky turned pale blue and the birds began chirping. I waited until neighbors began walking their dogs and stretching on porches. I waited until Karen, exhausted but proud, walked back to her house with that smug little smile glued across her face. Only then did I go outside. I walked to the dock casually, coffee mug in hand, pretending like it was any other morning. I looked at the empty space where my boat had been. I furrowed my brows, tilted my head, and pretended to be confused. Karen watched from her patio, hiding behind her curtains, barely able to contain her excitement. She thought she had finally won, and I made sure she believed that. I stood there a little longer, sipping my coffee, acting like someone who just realized something was missing but didn't know what happened, because the best traps don't close when the bait is taken, they close when the thief believes they got away clean. Karen needed to feel victorious before the collapse. She needed the high before the fall. She needed to think she had outsmarted me, and that was why I pretended not to notice the theft, because her false victory was as.
From the moment Karen pushed my boat into the dark water, believing she was performing some heroic community duties, the real trap had already begun unfolding quietly, invisibly, and with a precision she could never have imagined. She thought she was the hunter, sneaking through the shadows with her little raft and forged papers. She thought she was the authority. She thought she was in control. But the truth was, every step she took had already been predicted, prepared for, and perfectly positioned to snap shut around her at the right moment. The first part of the trap was digital, and she didn't even know it existed. When she cut the ropes, she triggered the motion sensors on the dock's silent alarms that didn't ring out loud, but sent instant notifications to a secured system. At the same time, the camera's ID setup captured clear footage of her face, her tools, the raft, and every movement she made. These weren't cheap home cameras, they were professional grade, night vision capable, set to record in high resolution. Every angle, every gesture, every slice of her cutters across my ropes was stored automatically off-site, so not even she could destroy the evidence. Then came the GPS. Karen had no idea my boat had been fitted with a deep embedded tracking device, originally meant for commercial fishing vessels, a device that could survive rain, storms, even submersion. Its signal updated every few seconds. The moment she tugged the boat into motion, the tracker created a time-stamped map of its journey, recording distance, route, speed, and direction. When she crossed the invisible boundary into HOA-controlled land, the system flagged it as unauthorized relocation. Not a single thing she did went unnoticed. But the most important part of the trap wasn't the technology. It was her arrogance. Karen believed the HOA supported her. She believed her forged documents were enough. She believed her version of the truth would always triumph because she said it loudly enough and with enough confidence. She had built her whole identity around being the enforcer of rules, even ones she invented. So when she woke up the morning after stealing my boat, she wasn't nervous. She wasn't even cautious. She was proud. The way she strutted around that morning, watering her plants with her chin up, greeting neighbors with a smug smile, acting like a queen who had solved a kingdom's biggest problem, it was almost impressive how deeply she believed in her own fantasy. But she had no idea what was coming. I didn't call the police that morning, not because I couldn't but because I didn't need to. The system had already done that for me. When the GPS device detected unauthorized movement into the HOA's restricted maintenance area, it triggered an automated report to local authorities that I had pre-authorized months earlier when neighborhood vandalism issues were rising. Karen didn't know that. She thought she'd hidden her crime well, moving under the cover of darkness, wearing gloves, acting like a stealth operative. What she didn't know was that the cameras captured footage from 10 different angles, that motion sensors recorded her every step, and that the GPS tracker reported her route every few seconds. Theft wasn't just a suspicion, it was documented fact. The officers arrived just after 9 in the morning. 2 patrol cars pulled into the cul-de-sac. Neighbors peeked through windows. Curtains twitched. Dogs barked. Slowly, the street filled with whispers. I was on my porch, calmly sipping coffee, pretending to be confused but concerned. Karen stepped out onto her own porch wearing a robe and slippers, her eyebrows raised in innocent curiosity. She called out, "Is everything okay, officer?" Her voice was sweet. Too sweet. One of the officers approached me first. "Sir, We received a notification overnight regarding unauthorized movement of your vessel. I nodded. I woke up and saw it gone. I assumed it drifted. I said it with the straightest face I could maintain. Karen's smile tightened. Another officer said, "Actually, we have footage and tracking logs." The vessel was manually relocated. Karen's eyes widened just slightly a crack in the mask, but she stayed quiet. The officer turned to her. "Ma'am, we'd like to ask if you're aware of any HOA activities involving the removal of boats." She didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said confidently. "I authorized it." I almost laughed. The officer frowned. "Ma'am, you authorized it." "Yes," she repeated, standing taller. "I am the compliance chair. I am responsible for enforcing community regulations. The boat was out of compliance, so I had it moved for safety inspection." Her confidence was astounding. The officer raised a brow. "Could you show us the official documentation of this authorization?" Karen smiled as if she had planned for this. "Of course." She hurried inside and returned with her forged documents, the same ones printed on her home computer. Full of legal phrases she didn't understand. Formatted like an HOA notice, but missing every legal requirement. She handed them over proudly. The officer glanced at the pages. Then he exchanged a look with his partner. "Ma'am, these aren't valid." Karen blinked. "What do you mean?" "Of course they revalid. I created them." "Exactly," the officer said. "You created them. They neither signed by the board nor approved in any meeting." "This is a misunderstanding," Karen insisted, her voice growing sharper. "The board told me to take action." "No," a voice said behind her. We all turned. Mr. Patterson, a board member, had stepped out of his house after overhearing the conversation. His face was pale with disbelief and embarrassment at what he was witnessing. "The board never authorized anything," he said firmly. "We rejected every proposal she brought up." Karen's mouth fell open. You read lyings." But she wasn't convincing anyone. The officers looked back at her. "Ma'am, we also have recorded footage showing you cutting the ropes and relocating the vessel. Would you like to explain that?" Her entire face drained of color. For the first time since this whole ordeal began, she looked rattled. I didn't cut anything," she stammered. "I was just securing it." I stayed silent, letting the moment deepen. The officer continued. "We have full high-resolution video, ma'am, as well as GPS data showing you transporting the vessel to the HOA maintenance area." Karen's breathing quickened. She opened her mouth, closed it, and then tried again. "It was an emergency," she blurted. "A safety emergency." "What kind of emergency?" the officer asked. She froze. This was it, the moment the trap tightened. She looked around desperately, hoping anyone would support her. But neighbors who once believed her now saw the truth. They had read her fake notices. They had heard her gossip. They had seen her creeping around the dock. And they knew she had acted entirely on her own. The officer finally said, "Ma'am, at this time, we are treating this as a case of property theft and trespassing." Karen gasped. "Theft? Trespassing? I was doing my duties." "No," the officer said calmly. "You went beyond your authority and knowingly removed private property." She turned to me then, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and rage. "You set me up." I met her eyes, calm and unbothered. "No, you set yourself up. I just watched." It was the truth. Karen wasn't arrested on the spot, but she wasn't free either. The officers issued her a citation, ordered her to return the boat immediately, and informed her that the case would be forwarded for legal review. Her face looked like it had collapsed inward as the weight of reality finally hit her. The true beauty of the trap wasn't in the technology or the footage or the police response. It was in the fact that Karen believed she had power right until the moment it was taken away. She believed she had authority. Right until the truth exposed her lies. She believed she had won. Right until the evidence crushed her confidence. Her downfall didn't come from a sudden blow. It came from a slow unraveling of illusions she had built for herself. And as the officers accompanied her to retrieve my boat from the maintenance shed, she looked smaller than she ever had. Defeated, embarrassed, terrified. And I watched it all unfold with the calm satisfaction of someone who had known exactly how this would end. Because the trap was never about catching her in the act. The trap was about letting her believe she was untouchable. So the fall would be one she could never deny. Karen had always walked around the neighborhood with the confidence of someone who believed the world rotated around her. Even after being caught red-handed trying to tow away my boat, she still clung to the hope that she could twist the narrative and escape the consequences. What she didn't understand, what she would never understand, was that her downfall had been sealed the moment she decided to cross the line from annoyance to criminal behavior. And now, she was about to learn what happens when someone is so blinded by their own entitlement that they forget the world doesn't bend to their will. The aftermath of the trap unfolded faster than anyone expected. The police had taken her statement, taken my statement, reviewed the paperwork, the video evidence, the audio recordings, the fake invoice she had forged, and the HOA towing authorization she had illegally created. Karen looked increasingly unstable as each document was brought to light. Her voice trembled, her hands shook, and her excuses fell apart like sand slipping through her fingers. She kept insisting it was just a misunderstanding. But every officer on the scene knew exactly what she had tried to pull. The real twist came the next morning. I woke up to the sound of rapid knocks on my door. Neighbors, at least a dozen of them, all whispering loudly with frantic confusion. I stepped outside, barely awake, and saw them clustered around someone holding a stack of printed emails, budget reports, and screenshots. It turned out Karen hadn't been acting alone. The HOA board 3 members Karen had manipulated into believing I was violating multiple neighborhood guidelines were suddenly in hysterics because their involvement in her schemes had come to light. One of my neighbors, Daniel, handed me the papers. "You need to say this," he whispered, as if afraid Karen would materialize behind him. And honestly, with how chaotic she had become lately, I didn't blame him. It turned out Karen had been emailing the HOA board members for months, feeding them exaggerated or completely fabricated complaints about me. She had been the anonymous resident, reporting my yards, my cars, my boat, my lightings, even the way I kept my trash bins. Every single complaint that had ever been filed against me traced back to her. And more importantly, she had convinced the HOA board to approve her plan to remove unauthorized property, a plan that centered completely around stealing my boat. The board members had signed documents Karen provided, believing they were standard HOA forms. But those forms had been altered by her. She had inserted fake bylaws, added fake violations, and edited policy language to make it appear as though she had full authority to act. In other words, Karen had orchestrated the entire operation, and the HOA board was caught in the fallout with her. Once word spread, the entire neighborhood erupted. People stormed out of their homes. Arguments broke out on porches. Neighbors who had ignored HOAs for years were suddenly reading through every policy, looking for signs that Karen had manipulated more than just me. Dozens of residents began telling stories, times Karen had threatened to fine them, times she had made up rules, times she claimed the HOA needed money for special improvement projects, but refused to show receipts. It was as if someone had turned on a light in a room full of cockroaches, and now they were scattering. Karen tried to hide in her house, but people weren't letting it go. The police had already questioned her the previous night, but now more people were calling in complaints, demanding action. The HOA president, a nervous older man named Harold, came to my door personally that afternoon, trembling like he had seen a ghost. We didn't know," he stammered. "She lied to us. She handled all documentation. She said there were numerous concerns about your property, that the community agreed action had to be taken. Did any of you verify anything? I asked calmly. He wilted. No. Karen had relied on two things: their laziness and their blind trust in her. And she was an expert at using both. Within 48 hours, the HOA called an emergency community meeting. Over 60 residents showed up angry, frustrated, and ready to demand accountability. I stood in the back, listening quietly, my arms crossed as Karen walked into the room with the arrogance of someone who still believed she could talk her way out of anything. The moment she sat down, the accusations began. You lied about my landscaping. You tried to fine me for having guests. You told me my fence height violated HOA code, but it doesn't. You said my Christmas lights were banned. You harassed my kids when they played basketball. One after another, people stood and aired their grievances. Karen's composure crumbled with every shout. The board members looked like they wanted to sink into the floor. Harold read through the printed emails and forged documents and buried his face in his hands. Karen tried to defend herself, claiming she was just trying to preserve property values. But no one bought it anymore. Her reign of intimidation had officially ended. When the votes were cast, the decision was unanimous. Karen was removed from the HOA board permanently and barred from participating in any neighborhood governance for life. The remaining board members were suspended pending investigation. A new election was scheduled for the following month. And then came the legal consequences. The police investigation had wrapped up quickly due to the overwhelming evidence, my surveillance footage, the audio recordings, the forged documents, and multiple witness statements. When officers returned for her final interview, Karen still believed she could talk her way out. But she couldn't spin forged signatures and fake invoices. She was charged with attempted theft of property, forgery, filing false documents, trespassing, misuse of HOA authority. Seeing her handcuffed and guided into the back of a patrol car was surreal, not because I enjoyed seeing someone fall, but because she had built her entire existence around controlling others. And now she couldn't even control herself. Neighbors gathered on their lawns, watching the scene unfold. Some recorded it. Some murmured in disbelief. A few whispered, "Finally," as if justice had been overdue for years. Unmazed, I stood off to the side, leaning against my restored boat, feeling the weight of the whole ordeal finally lift. The trap had worked, not because I wanted revenge, but because I wanted peace. And now the neighborhood finally understood the monster they had enabled. In the days that followed, things changed dramatically. People approached me to apologize, to thank me, and to admit they had been intimidated by Karen for years. The neighborhood began to feel like an actual community again, lighter, freer, less tense. The new HOA board sent me an official apology letter and refunded every unjust fine Karen had ever issued. They also passed a new rule requiring all HOA actions to be verified by at least 3 independent officers and documented transparently. But the biggest change came the morning I took my boat out for the first time since the incident. As I drove through the neighborhood, people waved. Kids pointed excitedly. Someone even jokingly shouted, "Don't let Karen tow it again." For the first time in a long time, I felt peace. Karen's downfall wasn't just about her stealing my boat. It was about exposing a system she had corrupted and freeing the entire community from her grip. She had thought she was untouchable, that her manipulation and authority would shield her forever. But entitlement always has a breaking point. And in her case, the moment she touched my boat, she pushed herself right over the edge.